What's up? Today we're going to talk all about trilogies. Why are they so popular? What are their downfalls? What are my favorite and least favorite ones? See you after the jump. Recently I've just been thinking a lot about trilogies. I don't know why, why are there so many trilogies in fantasy, and why are so many almost great but then have some problems with them? Most of us have heard about the second book in a trilogy is always the worst, or the second movie is always the worst. And it just got me thinking, why don't we have a lot more duologies? Like, I rarely ever see a fantasy book and its sequel, particularly in high fantasy. So it turns out maybe my perception of how many trilogies are in high fantasy aren't necessarily correct. So I wanted to just check on my biases a little bit, and I looked up some lists of the best fantasies of all time, and I just wanted to run some stats on how many of them were trilogies. So I started off with the most recent Times 100 Best Fantasy of All Time list, and I was surprised that only 7 out of 100 were actually trilogies. Now, I did have a little bit of a problem with this list for many reasons. I know a lot of you did, but mostly it's because a lot of it was more middle grade and YA fantasy, and I was particularly thinking more like high fantasy and adult fantasy in particular. So I wanted to kind of know if there was something better. So I found another website's 100 Best Fantasy list that seemed pretty legit. Like, a lot of the titles were things I recognized. It seemed like a good list. And in that case, it raised our percentage to 29%. Now, I don't really know what that percentage means. It doesn't seem particularly high. But then as I looked at other series in that list, I realized that if it wasn't something that was super long, say, Wheel of Time, Game of Thrones, Stormlight, whatever you want to say, that the trilogy was the next most common, right? There weren't actually a lot of quartets, and there were basically no standalones and duologies. I think there might have been like one duology. So that makes sense, right? In high fantasy, we're probably not going to have a lot of standalone. I can't think of a lot of standalone high fantasy. I can think of standalone adult fantasy, but not as much high. And I think it's just obvious reasons. We need more world building. There's just a lot more going on in those worlds. And it seems like the extended series is more popular. So I feel like in that case, maybe that's why trilogies feel so present in adult fantasy, is because if it's not going to be some super long series, it's more than not going to be a trilogy. Here's the thing though. I wish we had more duologies. I think a lot of trilogies I've read could be better as a book and its sequel. Here, let's bring back duologies. That's really the point of this video. No, it's not. I'm just kidding. When I was doing my research though, I found out that there actually is a name for the second book not being as good as the rest in the trilogy. And the name for it in the industry is the middle book syndrome. And it's often compared to the middle child syndrome. The first book gets all the attention and the world building and the newness and the introductions. And then the baby, or the third book, gets all the best conclusions and climaxes. And that leaves the second book to lay forgotten and not have as many good things in them. Now, a lot of people like to claim that trilogies are so prevalent in high fantasy because of Lord of the Rings. They say Lord of the Rings was that book that really brought mainstream fantasy, and we look to it for a lot of our tropes and also a lot of how we organize things. Now, if we want to get really nerdy, we could say that Lord of the Rings really wasn't a trilogy, right? According to most sources, Tolkien felt that the Lord of the Rings was really one long story, but that wasn't going to really work for publishers at the time, so they put it into 3 books. And then there's some people who claim that it's really more like 6 books put into 3 volumes. Either way, it's not really a trilogy. But really, for all intents and purposes, it feels like a trilogy to everyone that has experienced it. There's 3 movies, there's 3 books. We experience it as a trilogy. So maybe there's some truth to that. But there's also some other reasons that trilogies may feel more prevalent in high fantasy. Another valid reason is just that we as individuals tend to see stories in 3 acts. There's the 3-act story structure where we have the setup, the conflict, and the resolution. And because we're used to those things in 3s, that a series as a whole can very conveniently be put into 3 spots following that 3-act structure. Or even further, research just shows that humans in general like things in 3s. There's the writing rule of 3s that claims that things like characters or events that come in 3s are more satisfying, humorous, and good writing to the reader. There are things like the 3 Musketeers, the 3 Little Pigs, 3 Billy Goat Gruff. There's also our general phrases that often come in 3s, like ready, aim, fire, 1, 2, 3, go, the good, the bad, the ugly, 3rd time's the charm. We even speak in 3s. we don't really feel like a list is a list if it has 2 things on it. We generally want 3 things on it. So, or is our love for trilogies just because a duology doesn't feel complete? I can honestly kind of understand that. Maybe seeing 2 books in a series just doesn't make it feel like a series. It's a book and a sequel, and if you want it to be a series, you might as well just make it a trilogy. So I want to talk about some popular trilogies that are floating around and kind of my opinion on where they fall in this trilogy setback list. From what I can tell, there's kind of 2.5 main problems. You've got 1, the middle book syndrome, which we've talked at length about. 2, you have there's not enough content for 3 books and it could have been shoved into 2. And then I've got 2B, which is a different little subclass, which is like the first book in the trilogy is by far the best. And I feel like a lot of trilogies fall into that. The first trilogy that comes to mind when I think of that whole middle book syndrome is actually J.R.R. Mistborn. I know some people like the second book a lot. I personally thought the first and third were vastly better. The second one dragged a little bit for me. The interesting thing about this trilogy is that there's definitely enough content for all 3 books. This isn't a trilogy that I feel like should have been a duology, but it is a trilogy where I thought the second book was by far the weakest book and it could have been improved. I don't know how to improve that. I think there was a lot of things in it that were important, but like many second things in a trilogy, it was too much setup for the third book and kind of not enough action on its own. The next series I think of with this problem is the Darker Shades of Magic series. The second book by far was the worst book in the series, and this one definitely suffered from there wasn't enough content to write the second book. This could have easily been a duology. The second book is, first of all, the longest, which also annoys me, but that's a time for another video. But it brings in a completely useless plot point. Like a majority of this is used up on this thing that really has no bearing on the overall plot. And it was kind of fun. It was an exciting plot point, I guess, but I just spent most of the time being annoyed that I was reading this thing that clearly wasn't furthering the overarching plot. And in fact, the overarching plot gets very little attention in that second book. And I just honestly think it was definitely one of these books where like, you could have just written this in 2. This series also suffers from the first book by far being the best. I actually just love A Darker Shade of Magic. I thought it was so creative. And the next 2 books just didn't live up for me at all. So this is definitely like one of those trilogies that just hit a lot of those typical trilogy problems. Another trilogy where the first book was by far the best, well, at least I think I actually DNF'd the series after the second book because it was so bad, was the Wool trilogy. I have them, but they're just too tall for me to get off my bookshelf. But I read Wool. I thought it was really interesting. I thought it was kind of a really fun sci-fi. And then I read the second book and it was so worthless. It just didn't further the plot very well, or did it in a really bad way. I was shocked at how terrible it was. Didn't finish the series. I just ended up Wikipediaing what happened in the third, which is what I do when a second book disappoints me so much. Again, it was one of those things that was like, I don't think this needed to be a trilogy. I don't think you had enough content for this story. I think you could have done Wool and a sequel, and that would have probably helped you not be so repetitive. I think that's what really gets it, is series that they feel like need to be a trilogy and there's just like not enough content there. This may be an unpopular opinion, but another trilogy I feel like suffers from some of these things is actually the Broken Earth trilogy. I think that the first book in this series is by far the best. It was the one that took me in the most, the one that I felt most emotionally connected to. But like J.R.R. Mistborn, I do think there was enough content for all 3 of these books. Like N.K. Jemisin had a story to tell and there was enough in them. I just didn't feel like she necessarily put the events in such a way that the other 2 books were as enthralling as the first book. And I think it could have just been cleaned up a little bit. And so as a trilogy, I don't think it's nearly as strong as that first book, the 5th season. Another trilogy I think is going to suffer from this is probably the Kingkiller's Chronicles. The first book, I think already is going to be by and far the best book in the series. People already had a problem with Wise Man's Fear. I was definitely one of them. I didn't think it was nearly as strong, and I had problems with stuff that happened in the later half of the book. The first book was obviously a masterpiece, at least I think it was. And so it'll be interesting if we do ever get that third book to see how it's received. Is this a book that would have been a better standalone? Maybe we'll never know, but I'd be interested to see where this falls in the trilogies. Now, I have to give credit where credit is due, and there was a trilogy that immediately came to mind that, in my opinion, doesn't suffer from any of these trilogy problems, and that is the Farseer trilogy by Robin Hobbs. Now, I have my own personal problems with the third book. It didn't necessarily end in the way that I thought was as strong as it could have, But one thing I have to say about this trilogy is there was enough content for the entire trilogy. The first book wasn't by far the best book in the trilogy, and I think it has the best second book in any trilogy I've ever read. And I know that's a bold statement, but I can still remember where I was when I finished that second book, Royal Assassin, because it was such a shocking ending. And I'm not going to go into it. I don't want to spoil why it was such an ending that it was. But what I can say about the trilogy is that it perfectly followed that 3-act system from storytelling, because the first book is clearly the setup, the second book is clearly the conflict, and the third book is clearly the resolution. But each individual book also has that 3-story part arc where each book has that setup, conflict, and conclusion. And so it works so well that each book individually has the 3 parts, but each book separately in the overall story is one of those 3 parts. And I think she just did an amazing job at that. And that will probably always go down as one of the most successful second books in a trilogy, in my opinion. So thanks for embarking on me through a discussion of trilogies. Why maybe we like writing in trilogies so much, why they're such a fantasy genre staple, at least it feels like. And I want to know what trilogies you've read that maybe fall into some of these categories, or other trilogies like the Robin Hobb trilogy I mentioned that really didn't have any of these problems and you felt was like 1, 2, and 3 were all equally great, they didn't have a slump, and why you think that was. I'm really curious to hear, and I need some more series that I want to finish, so please tell me if there's some good ones so that I can read them. And as always, if you like this video, please like, comment, and subscribe. And if you want to see what I'm currently reading, you can check me out on Instagram at bookborn.reviews. I'll see you next time. Bye.